Would you like your character to be more fun, but you don't know exactly how to make that happen? Well, you're in luck, because behind today's secret door, how flaws are fun. So behind today's secret door, how flaws are fun. This is Secret Door, a channel devoted to in-depth discussion about Dungeons and Dragons, and my name is Matt Morich. Before I get started, I have started a Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the channel, your help would be greatly appreciated and much needed. And many thanks to Marcelo and Doug for your support. So while I talk an awful lot on this channel about how to make your character more effective, role-playing is really where the fun of the game really is, and it always has been for me. Now, don't get me wrong, playing a great character, a powerful character, an effective character, that's a whole joy in and of itself. But playing a memorable character, a fun character, a character that you can relate to, those are the things that make the games that you'll go look back on from years from now. You'll look back on those characters and remember those. You're not going to remember so much how effective your character was per se, but you will remember how you connected with that character. So just to put out a few caveats here, I'm certainly not trying to minimize the importance of playing an effective character, far be it from me to ever say such a thing, and to make role-playing the end-all be-all. But role-playing should be at least as important, ideally, I should say. I think role-playing should be equally important to being effective. The next caveat is that I'm going to be talking about flaws here. Now, as I describe these flaws, as I go through them, I believe there are 10 on the list, bear in mind that the most important thing that you have to do as a player when you're making your character is you have to have a good reason for why the party puts up with you. Because if you were to take any of these flaws and take them to their furthest possible extent, which is not what I'm recommending, but if you did, let's say you really wanted to go really full tilt on one of these or several of these flaws, you're going to be in a situation where you could quickly be viewed as far more trouble than you're worth. While I'm emphasizing the importance of flaws here, I want you to also keep in mind that it's important to have virtues that the character also possesses that the party will appreciate. So when you're making your character in the player's handbook, you have lists of available flaws that you can choose from. All of those flaws, if you took any one of them, you could probably boil them down to one of the flaws that I'm going to mention here. They get kind of specific given to the character background that they're dealing with. I'm speaking in a much more general sense. I'm talking about basic personality flaws. Now, role players very typically don't like installing weaknesses built into their characters. They resist it, and it's understandable. You're playing a game, and depending on the nature of the game that you're playing, loading yourself up with things that are going to hinder you doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we're not talking about a board game, and we're certainly not talking about a game where the object is to win. The object in a role-playing game for a player is to have something to play. And if you can embrace the flaws of your character, find the ones that really make sense for that character, that will give you something to play, that play to your strengths as a player in terms of what kind of things you can deal with at the table. I don't want to use the term perform, but you understand what I mean. How you can portray those flaws, what your strengths are there. If you can incorporate those well, then you have something to play. You could write a 50-page background on your character, and it wouldn't go half as far as finding one good flaw that you can really sink your teeth into that will give you something to play at the table. So please keep that in mind, that when I'm talking about flaws here, what I'm really talking about is how to make yourself a more effective role player. In a very real way, flaws are the way you optimize your character for role playing. So the first one on the list is gluttony. Now, gluttony can be a really safe pick to pick as a flaw. It can actually be a little bit charming. It can be funny. It could be something as harmless as the hobbits from The Lord of the Rings and their love for food, or it could be as grotesque as the Baron Harkonnen from Dune. This is, of course, a really simple flaw to play. Everybody has some food that they like quite a bit, and you can easily just imagine and extrapolate that to many foods, all foods, and just have that idea of that your character is, for whatever reason, is always wanting more, and more. As the faults that I'm going to list here, it is a safe one because it is harmless and it doesn't affect other party members. And it can be charming and fun, as I mentioned earlier, or it can be crippling and grotesque, as I mentioned in the case of the Baron Harkonnen. But either way, you will always have something to play because you'll always be able to bring up, when can I eat? When, just think of how the hobbits, how fun and charming it was when they were asking for elevensies. So not too much to talk about here, but just the idea that the character is a glutton will give you something simple to play. Now, as I go along here, I am not suggesting by any means that you stop at just picking one. Pick a couple. People are flawed, man. I'm very flawed. So if you're playing a character, there should be, the more rounded you can make that character, the better. And I'm not saying have the character riddled with flaws, but having 2 or 3 could really give you a lot to play at any given point. And we'll get there, so as we go along. But gluttony, a good, safe, and fun, potentially fun pick. The next is lazy. Now, lazy is another one that's pretty harmless to the rest of the party and can also be very, very fun. So this is the character that never gets up on time. This is the character that will quickly agree to another short rest. This is a character that would like to take as many rests as they can along the way because, you're tired. So laziness gives us a chance to start thinking about how a fault can lead to other faults, breed other faults, or is simply just a natural extension of that basic fault. So a person that's lazy may just be somebody that is not willing to suffer. That's really understandable, right? But when you're talking about the adventuring life, there's a lot of suffering that goes in. There's a lot of hard traveling. Obviously, there's combat and there's death and all that. But the unwillingness to suffer is really, it's basic in us. Nobody likes to suffer. A character that is unwilling to suffer, you can relate to that rather easily. And a character, therefore, that is unwilling to suffer, to put out that extra effort, that character might also, therefore, look at pain differently. So you have laziness that is actually also breeding something that could become someone that exaggerates injuries, someone that is almost a hypochondriac in the end of things. And obviously you can take that really, really, really far, and I'm not suggesting you do that. But finding that balance of this flaw and how it might extend, why you have this flaw, could relate to other maladies that you wouldn't obviously think of necessarily. What's interesting about a lazy character as well is it can play really well in, this is the first thing that I'm going to start talking about against type. You wouldn't think of a martial character as being lazy, but martial characters, especially frontline fighting types, are going to be the types that are going to have to be spending a lot of effort on their physical condition. And that takes energy. That takes time. So anything that isn't related to spending energy on those things, they could just view that as not worth doing or not having the energy for. So you could very well have a lazy paladin, a lazy barbarian, And those kinds of juxtapositions where you wouldn't naturally assign that to such a character are what's interesting. And I'll be bringing this type of thing up a lot as we go along. Next on the list is lust. Now, this one obviously is pretty obvious, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm not going to talk about the really obvious applications of this. Because I think if you go too obvious with that, you are bound to get into trouble. And it could be you could be getting into trouble that makes other players at the table uncomfortable. So I'm not going to spend time talking about that. What I'm going to talk about are some of the less obvious ideas. So that could be changed into something where your character simply can't say no to a pretty face. It can't say no to somebody of the opposite sex or someone that they find attractive. By some extension, if you look at the Arthurian knights, and they are a great model for paladins, in the Arthurian code, there is a rule, a central rule, that you cannot refuse a reasonable request of a lady. And that simply wasn't just an Arthurian idea. That was an idea of chivalry, which is a whole other thing, and that's a very long topic. But there are plenty of characters that are not paladins, per se, that might have the noble background or might have a courtly life that they lived in the past. And those kind of ideas, if they were resident in that court, could have easily stamped themselves on your character. Now, obviously, having such a huge thing where you simply can't say no to a reasonable request of a person of the opposite sex, or however you're going to define it, this is a huge vulnerability to your character. And that's what's great. That's the kind of thing that can lead you into endless trouble, and it isn't something that is self-indulgent. It's something that the game master will have to be specifically using to mess you over. And when I say mess you over, I don't necessarily mean it in the adversarial DM kind of way. I mean that in the sense of good fun and making for a good story. And that's what you want these things to do, is to help nurture opportunity for good stories. Next up is paranoia. Now, paranoia is one that obviously can be a lot of fun. It can also be a real pain. This is one that can really hinder play. I would recommend that if you are going to go with something that is a severe paranoid, that you show great restraint as to when you bring it up. Because if it is brought up for fun, it will get old, because it's invariably going to be a stumbling block or an impediment to doing something that the party wants to do, because you're opposing it because you don't trust so-and-so or blah, 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 blah. So I'm not saying don't play a paranoid character, because I think it can be a lot of fun, but it is one that is more fraught with some trouble, and you need to recognize that before you decide to play somebody like that. Playing the paranoia as suspicious is a much safer route than going with something that is borderline nutso. Playing the character as overtly suspicious of everybody, and that could be you're actually paranoid, but you play it as suspicious, is a much safer bet. And it can be much more amusing, because you'll be more likely to go along with things, even though you're keeping your eye on that guy. And that can be fun, and that can be memorable. So this kind of a character, whether you want to call it paranoid or overtly suspicious, whichever way, is a character that can quickly reduce itself to being one note if you're not careful, but it can be pretty fun. So next up is the hothead. Now, the hothead can be a lot of fun to play. Obviously, being a hothead can get you into endless amounts of trouble, but generally speaking, I think of all the types that can get you into a lot of trouble, this one is probably the safest one. We generally have an understanding for why people might react in a hot-headed fashion. Even an enemy, or it doesn't have to be an enemy, but somebody that you're in a negotiation with, if you were to fly off the handle, everybody can sort of understand how such a thing can happen. So there's ways of massaging that and dealing with that in the moment that the party can deal with. If you're a fan of stand-up comedy, using something like Bill Burr as an example of how much fun it can be to be hot-headed is a great example. Now, obviously, when hot-headedness just goes straight to violence, I think that you've jumped the shark really quick. So allow yourself to get to violence. Allow yourself. What I mean by that is allow yourself to take the step by step to get to violence. But you can certainly start off with, in a flash rage and make all kinds of crazy threats and what have you because you are hot-headed. But give yourself as a character that space to not just jump immediately to violence. Once you jump to violence, there's really very little to do about turning back. And in those kind of situations, you are going to be causing endless trouble for the entire party. So take great care if you're going to play the hot-headed character, but it can be extremely memorable and a lot of fun. Okay, so now we're getting to my personal favorites. So the next one is pride. Now, this is the classic flaw, and it can take many, many, many forms. Probably the most common form of pride that you will see in a Dungeons and Dragons table, if a player is choosing to play it, is the conceited character. The conceited character, especially paired with a character that isn't particularly bright, is a comedy classic. The conceited idiot is endlessly amusing, and if you were to play a deeply conceited character, finding a gaping flaw like that to pair with it is critical. If you're wanting to play it for humor, but you don't have to play pride for humor. Think about if you've never seen the great television show Breaking Bad. Walter White's entire problem is pride. And look at the endless amount of evil that pride brings him to. And all of the wake of destruction that comes simply from one man's pride. So the amount of variability that you can play with pride it can be for almost buffoonery or for Greek tragedy. It's a great pick. If you can find exactly how it will fit for your character, it's a great one to look at. And the interesting thing about how to play pride is, like I said, with the conceited idiot, obviously the conceited idiot has no reason to be conceited. That's the whole joke, right? So finding a reason for your character to not have pride in what they're taking so much pride in creates that humor. Now, pride could also be vanity, and vanity is, of course, another a great one, and they're all tied together. So if you are a vain character, obviously, if you were to pair that with a character that isn't particularly good looking, but they're incredibly vain, there's obviously some humor there. But remember that nobody can see what your character looks like. They'll see you being vain, how you're playing it, but they won't see the character and what they look like. So some of the humor is lost there, but you can still definitely play that. But vanity is a great offshoot of pride to pick, a great one to pick. Then we get to greed. Now, greed is a classic. It's not particularly actually one of my favorites, but it is one of those ones that has a lot of background in fantasy literature and what have you. Having a player character be greedy can be one of those things that's really, really dangerous. Because if you start playing that you want everything in terms of treasure, magic items, blah, 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 that's going to get old super fast. And that's going to be a good reason for the party to just want to say, let's get rid of this guy. Now, I say these kinds of things knowing full well that the actual social structure of the table is going to be such that they can't really probably ask you to leave for such a thing as that. But when you are stretching the sense of realism for the other players to such a degree that they have to keep asking themselves, why are we putting up with you? That's what you want to avoid. Greed is one of these ones that can just blow up really badly and create all kinds of personal problems at the table. Just like if you were to play a lustful character and you were hitting on another player character, that's one of the classic no-nos at a table, because it's just, you never know how someone's going to take that. So if you were to play greed, what I would do is I would adapt it into something as being cheap. Now, a cheap character obviously can be very amusing. And certainly, you would think that I'm telling you all these things to play everything for laughs. I'm not. But I recognize that the vast majority of players, that's what they're going to want to play. And even if you're playing a deeply serious character, finding some humor in that character is really important. So a character that's cheap, a character that never tips, a character that's really, really stingy can obviously be amusing, and it really doesn't hurt anybody, and that's the really good thing here. And it can also create the occasional problem. And I mean the occasional good kind of problem, an interesting problem, not a problem for the other players. So just for example, let's say you had an opportunity to buy a magic item and you really, really wanted that magic item, but the seller would only sell it to you at a ridiculous price. And you're a cheapskate. Are you going to knuckle under and say, because the player in you is going to want the magic item and probably is willing to pay whatever the person, if it's rare enough and what have you, you're probably willing to just grab it because it's powerful and you want it. But would your character pay for it? Now, you could get around something like this and still play in character and simply say, look, I'll pay you what I'm willing to pay, and offer something else, maybe another commodity or maybe a service to the seller. Now, this could inadvertently rope in the whole party, but that could also be a form of adventure for the DM to exploit, and that could be a really good thing. So playing a character as a cheapskate, and of course this could apply to any character, but playing a character as a cheapskate, it can be amusing. It is a form of greed. It's a way of manifesting greed without it becoming dangerous, I guess is my point. And then we get to one that has enormous potential. And that is one that you almost never see players do at the table. And that is cowardice. Now, it's understandable because you're playing Dungeons and Dragons. You want to be playing an adventuring hero, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not talking about being an abject coward, because obviously you are playing Dungeons and Dragons and you are going to have to play an adventurer. So when I say cowardice, you're going to have to, again, find a specific idea. So it could be something as basic as this. It could be your character is terrified of the undead. Now, that makes perfect sense. It's finite. It's not going to come up all the time, but it's certainly going to come up. How that character grapples with facing that kind of a specific fear is going to be interesting. Now, it doesn't have to be the undead. It could be anything. Indiana Jones was afraid of snakes. So finding a specific thing that your character has to grapple with is really interesting. So finding a particular thing that your character could be afraid of is interesting, and how you are going to choose to deal with it when you are confronted with it is what's going to be even more interesting. Now, I would recommend that before you even pick something like that, let's say you went with undead, and you have whatever, what character you're going to be playing, what character class, subclass, et cetera, et cetera. Have an idea ahead of time how your character might overcome that at the table, so you're not completely shutting play down at the table, either by inaction or by trying to think of something. And just as I've been talking about all the other flaws, you can find degrees for this. It doesn't have to be crippling cowardice where you flee or run away. It doesn't have to be something where you're crawling into a ball. But it could be one of those things that you just don't want to do it. Maybe you're afraid of heights. Maybe the character's afraid of drowning. Any of those kinds of fears. But I say cowardice because it covers all the bases. But the idea of cowardice is really interesting, because if you were to apply it in an unexpected way, if you were to apply the idea of cowardice to a martial character like a paladin or a barbarian, that's interesting. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that they would never fight, because what would be the point? But maybe the character doesn't want to fight anything that they consider to be beneath them, because the fear there is that what if they were to lose to something that's inferior? Losing face, or maybe the character is intelligent enough or has seen enough in combat to know that anything can happen in combat, and I don't want to die at the hands of that because it got lucky. So cowardice could take many, many kinds of forms, and it would be particularly interesting in a martial character. It's going to be much easier to play in a caster. Casters have all kinds of ways of dealing with things. They don't have to physically confront things, so you're going to have definite avenues of playing a cowardly caster, and it doesn't have to be a craven coward. It could just be one particular idea or thing or situation they're afraid of. But finding something that puts fear into your character is interesting. And again, like I said before, Indiana Jones hated snakes. And when you found out right at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark that Indiana Jones was afraid of snakes, it was endearing. You loved him for that because you'd already shown you how brave he was. So finding something like this doesn't reduce your character, it can amplify it. And of course it can be funny and it can be amusing and charming and all those things, but it amplifies, it's salt for the character. It's that seasoning that you really want. And I'm not saying that cowardice is the answer for all characters or anything like that, any of these flaws that I'm talking about. But essentially that cowardice is going to be the rarest one that players will pick, and it's going to be potentially the most interesting one to pick. Okay, we've got two more on the list, and the next one is dishonesty. And this is one that can also go quickly off the rails, because if you are a dishonest character, that will obviously mean that you're not a trustworthy character, and therefore why should the party trust you? So how you choose to play that dishonesty is incredibly important. Now, the really amusing way to play a dishonest character is the character that exaggerates everything and tells tall tales and just really can't bring themselves to even tell something that's even remotely resembling the truth. I mean, there's like a kernel of the truth in there, but it's been amplified to such a degree because the character, again, maybe this is also pride leading to telling tall tales and conceit and all those things, bringing it together here into the form of dishonesty. But having a character that is a serial liar or a manipulative, I guess the danger is a character that is going to be being dishonest in a manipulative way. That's the character that will quickly be, not only is it going to be distrusted by the other party members, your other players are going to get really tired of you. Because a person that lies really thinks they're clever. And if you're playing a character like that, it naturally pulls out of everybody else. There's a natural repulsion when you catch somebody lying in a way that when they're doing it for gain or for manipulation. If you do it, like I said, about telling tall tales and all that type of thing, that can be charming and amusing. It is one of those flaws that is full of great potential for good and bad, in the sense of it could be leading to an interesting character, but the bad could be that you could just be playing a virtually unplayable character. But like I've said before, find a way to scale it back to another way, other than the tall tale thing. You could also there could be things that you just simply won't tell the truth about. Maybe it's about your previous life. Maybe you make up stories about where you came from and what happened and blah, 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 blah. And that's where all of your dishonesty really lies. And that could also lead to tall tales about your background that you're constantly fabricating and making up. And a character like that can be really interesting. And if you are not actively deceiving the party in the here and now, other than telling about your past, it will bring into question whether they can trust you now. But if they kind of do trust you now, but you've lied about everything that happened before you, that can be a really interesting character. And last on the list, we'll talk about cruelty. Now, of all the flaws that I've mentioned here, cruel may be the one that is going to be the most attractive for a great number of players to play. And once again, like many of these flaws, it can lead you into some real problems. But being a cruel character can be incredibly, incredibly interesting. And when I say cruel, I don't mean having the capacity for cruelty. I think all adventurers have to have that capacity to be cruel. I'm talking about someone that is cruel. But what is interesting here is when you pair it with something, again, that you wouldn't necessarily jump to think about. So don't play an evil character as a cruel character. But if your character, let's say that your character were the classic lawful good character, I know alignments are done with now, but if you were a lawful good character, being cruel and lawful good, that's incredibly interesting and incredibly consistent. If you look at medieval society or if you look at puritanical society, those folks were cruel in their punishments. I mean, cruel. So, and the Puritans, you would classically say, or would as a meta idea, would be a lawful good idea, and yet they were cruel. And what that leads you to in playing in Dungeons and Dragons, if you were to play a lawful good character, you have the stereotype of it having to be like a Walt Disney kind of version of good. Who wants to play that? There's nothing to play there. Those characters are never terribly interesting. But a character that is, for what their point of view is, pure and good and righteous and all those type of things, but can be absolutely merciless, merciless to someone that has broken a code or a law. That's incredibly interesting. If there's a sense of justice there, that they're only doing it, obviously not out of the joy of cruelty for its own sake, but when it happens, maybe they take a certain joy in it. I suppose that's possible. But that juxtaposition, I find that to be incredibly interesting. I've played characters like this myself. And you can quickly put the table on tilt in a good way, that when you play a character like this, it may seem that you're playing a contradictory character. But very quickly, people will realize that isn't a contradictory idea at all. It is simply that we have a Walt Disney idea when it comes to certain things in D&D. And I don't know why that is, but when it comes to the idea of lawful good, chaotic good, I think people are more okay with. But if you're lawful good, you're supposed to just do everything right and never harm anybody, or blah, 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 blah. It's really weird to me when the idea lawful is in the name, and laws, if you break them, there's punishments. So it makes a lot of sense, and everybody will get that almost right away. Not everybody, but a lot of the players will get it pretty quickly that that's what you're playing. I can't recommend it highly enough to pair those ideas together. They make a lawful good character incredibly interesting. Or it doesn't even have to be cruelty, really, for that matter. If you're playing, especially if you're playing a lawful good character, find several of these flaws and put them in there. And find a way for the character to still be lawful good, still do everything that you would say makes the character a living example, but they're still flawed. And it'll give you something to play, something interesting. Well, that's all I've got. If you enjoyed the video, please like, please share, please subscribe. And if you're stuck and you don't know where to go, you can always search for a secret door. Until next time, I cast bless on all of you.